So what, from all of this, from this 2,200-year history of the Roman Empire, what lessons can we draw for modern times? Now we're sitting in America, this young empire. I know we're not calling it an empire, but,
Lots of people are calling it an empire. I thought it was sort of taboo. Yeah, in the 20th century, it was like, is America an empire now? But I think since the Iraq War, like since 2003, I've seen at least very casual uses of America and empire in the same, sentence without any kind of hand-wringing.
is it ever called that in academic setting?
Yes.
I mean, it's technically, I guess you could say,
Oh, yeah.
given the expanse of the military bases and the military might and the way that represents itself in the geopolitical context.
There are books published all the time that unironically discuss America as an empire in various ways. Yeah, no.
By the way, both positive and negative. So
Yes.
when you're saying a positive thing about America, calling it an empire, and when you're saying to criticize America, you call it an empire. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, most academic books aren't trying to do like either. They're just trying to analyze a situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What lessons about representing the people, about flourishing, about stability can we draw?
I will say that just drawing on what we were talking about a moment ago, that investing in institutions that work for the majority of your subjects, even if indirectly, like they have to pay a cost for them, but you have to explain to them why they're paying that cost, is to the benefit of the ruling classes as well. Because you're ideally you're thinking about long-term success and not just your own short-term, gain. And I think that's what this society tends to do well. The Romans generally, how they built roads for the centuries and the millennia. They built institutions too. One of the institutions they built was like the Christian church. Like they build things to last.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a good lesson beyond even the roads. I think institutions that explain, to people why they exist I think we could use some of that.
And also the first point you made about the East Roman Empire, I think you've said that U.S. foreign policy sometimes has quite a large gap between the rhetoric and the in modern times, the rhetoric and the action.
Yeah.
And so that's to the Machiavelli's point that we want to maybe narrow that gap for a successful empire, for a successful nation. The rhetoric has to match the action.
Yes.
And it doesn't quite for some of the foreign policy engagements in the world.
So in the context of the society I study, let's say the army's the single largest expense is doing pretty much what the emperors say that it's doing, which is protecting its subjects.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually what it's doing most of the time. Not all the time. So, for example, emperors will sometimes take the armies out on a raid or an expedition, crack some skulls, gather some plunder, come back, and this is done to glorify the emperor. Like, this does happen. But for the most part, they're doing that, not much else. And actually, in pre-modern context, it's very difficult to operate like, shadow foreign policies and things like this. Like, it's just not part of the, it's not in the cards. But America in particular has such a history of proclaiming the loftiest goals. It just sometimes breathtakingly implausible.
Plus the incredible engineering behind the military-industrial complex. So America is very good at creating the flamethrowers,
yes,
the technologies of war. And so the lofty goals combined with just a lot of profit that could be made on the technologies of war creates a very difficult situation to navigate where the gap naturally widens.
Yeah. I don't think most of the world even believes, what American leaders say their goals are, especially when it comes to like war, like spreading democracy. Really? I remember when they were trying to convince us, that the invasion of Afghanistan was a feminist war.
Oh, that was the thing, huh?
Oh, yes. They were to liberate the women from the burqas or whatever. And like the news was just flooded with like how terrible women have it in Afghanistan. It's like, you really trying to persuade me That's why you're sending armed forces. Like, anyway.
I think there's a lot of wake-up calls about the war in Afghanistan and Iraq where people realized that there is that gap between the rhetoric and the action. And I mean, that's how, because of a lot of people waking up to that, they create pressure on the government to close the gap, and that's how we kind of navigate this complicated world. But it's a costly one. I mean, these were extremely costly wars.
Yes.
On every front, on every measure.
Yep. But the same lesson was learned in like the Vietnam War. And that was such a disaster that essentially they had to abandon the conscript army, switch to a professional army. And like it took them so long to be able to like wage, these empire wars again because of the sheer damage that the Vietnam War did to the credibility of the military leadership in the country, right? This never happens this does not happen in Constantinople. You can be criticized for losing a war. That's one thing, right? But that you're using the army to do some no.
Some of this does have to do with the functioning of how democracy works, the temporary nature of the leaderships, and that they're very short-sighted because of the nature of the elected position of the executive. I mean, that's what we're trying to figure out as a human civilization, how to do this, in this particular case, the democracy thing.
There's no right answer. And by the way, I don't want to be ruled by kings or monarchs or emperors either. So it's like I wouldn't necessarily support that. I'm not advocating here for anything. I'm just trying to explain. But you're exactly right. We want democracy. We want leaders whom we can eject every 4 or 5 years, which includes sometimes their teams of experts and policy designers and whatever. And that comes at a cost too.
So you said that, the Roman Empire, maybe ancient Greece, maybe the societies before that, and now societies after that, the society we live in, are very different. And so applying the lessons of history, you have to be careful doing so. But are there things that are the same with us humans? So of everything you've studied across hundreds of years and centuries, are there aspects of human nature that kind of persist?
So look, intellectually, I have gone through periods when I was a grad student, it was, this was kind of when postmodernism, what we might call loosely, was kind of alive and well and had not yet been kicked in the pants. It was very common to find colleagues who did not believe that there was such a thing as, let's say, human nature. In other words, that, let's say, the parameters of human psychology are, yes, there's considerable variation, but they're within a certain set of, norms. Like we're not going to behave like different species, and that they did not believe that there was such a thing. In other words, that all of human history is essentially a series of incommensurate slices of difference, right? That you just couldn't go from one to the next. And I think it's a very problematic view for all kinds of reasons. Like how small do you slice these slices? I mean, I'm with Thucydides on this one, who says that, more or less human beings are going to, they're going to be after, right? They love and they hate and they have ambitions and they're incompetent and, you find the whole range of, the whole gamut of diversity pretty much in any group of about 20 or 30 people, you're going to find the same kinds of types. Now, culture then comes in and, tweaks things in all kinds of weird ways. And that's, as a historian, what I'd like to study. I like just how the culture will set the dials, right? But that the dials go from 1 to 10 for most people is like, yeah, I think so.
But every once in a while, there'll be a few folks who come along, whether it's Steve Jobs with a turtleneck or some guy with a weird mustache or with a funny hat, and those can turn the tides of history.
I think so. Occasionally, yes.
But they're just ultra skilled at the right time, at the right moment.
Oh, I believe that too. Oh, yeah. In other words, I also don't think that cultural systems or ideologies are so effectively totalitarian, that they sort of colonize the mind of every person. And so everyone in a culture is just like a clone. No, you encounter this sometimes in historical scholarship. And no, I think people can sometimes just think for themselves, or they can think outside the box, and they can do all kinds of things. And I always want to keep my mind open to that possibility when I'm encountering historical agents.